My birth certificate says that I'm white. Why? Because that's how they did things in New Mexico. If you weren't white, then you were Indian. And if you were Indian, you had no rights. You couldn't vote, you couldn't own property, you couldn't testify in court, right? I can trace my history, my genealogy back 400 years right here, right? And so to then suggest that I'm an immigrant is just offensive. My name that I'm known for, that if you Google and you find me, is Atekpatsin Masat. I am known as David Young. I am Apache. In English language, I'm Apache. I am Pueblo. I'm Tiwantewa. My ancestors come from Okeawinge. They come from Pawake. They come from Picuris. Those are the Pueblos, and then Apache. What people won't acknowledge is that when the English speakers got here from the East, about 160 years ago, more or less, they arrived here and there were groups of people here, and they just make the assumption that based on what they saw, that's all that there were, and that's it. But that's just not true. There has been movement of indigenous communities all through the mountains and all through the plains here for thousands and thousands of years. There are two primary linguistic groups here in this area for thousands of years, and those groups were the Apache speakers and the Nawa speakers. So when Americans think about Plymouth Rock and that whole bit, there was already a town here with European colonists, and those Europeans hailed from the Iberian Peninsula. They call themselves Spaniards, but there was no Spain at the time that they got here, so they were Castellanos. So they had already arrived here and they colonized this area. When they got here, there are a few things that they brought. They brought guns, they brought horses, diseases obviously, and they introduced the slave trade. And most people don't know about that, and they don't talk about that, and they forget about it. They think the only slaves that we have to regard are the ones that came from Africa. So what they needed was labor. So they introduced the slave trade, and what they would do is they wanted women, especially young women, very young women, barely into puberty. They wanted women for wives. They wanted women to do household chores and to do the work. They wanted young men to work the mines, and the older men they didn't need, so they just kill them. All along the Front Range here, you're sitting right up against the mountains here, the Front Range. From Wyoming down into New Mexico were Apache villages, and they had been here for thousands of years. People think, well, these were campgrounds and that people camped along this area, but that's not true. We weren't camping, we lived here, there were villages. We have a whole vast territory that is Apache territory, and then the Ute are also in this area. That's not to negate that there were other groups here. I'm attributing two primary groups, and those are the Apache speakers and the Nawa speakers. When guns and horses were introduced along with the slave trade, there was a group of people that had been banned from the Shoshone. And they were banned because they were young men that were just, there was nothing else you can do. They're just troublemakers. So they banished them from the tribe. And they formed their own tribe, but there were no women. So they had to go steal women for wives. And these became known as the Comanche. And the Comanche started stealing people along the Front Range and taking them down into New Mexico and further south and selling them. And then in exchange, they got guns and horses. This made them a pretty significant force to be dealt with all along the Front Range here. So throughout the 1700s, and there was one leader in particular who was known as Greenhorn. Throughout the 1700s, the Comanche were the power that were in this area. But what they ended up doing is, because they're raiding the villages of Apache peoples, the Apache peoples became nomadic. They left their villages out of safety, left the villages, and became nomadic up and down the plains, moved further south. So they've been displaced. Now they're displaced by the violence of the Apache and the introduction of the slave trade. However, it is because of the colonizers that came up from the south into this area that brought all this stuff. So people keep putting on their land acknowledgements, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute land. It's like, yeah, you have no idea. It'd be better if you just didn't put anything, because one, they're platitudes anyway, and two, they haven't done their history. The treaty that was written in 1848 actually had a stipulation. There were treaties that had been signed before the Treaty at Fort Laramie. And the treaties stated, because they wrote treaties with Apache people, and we said, you could pass through the land, but you can't stay here. And these treaties are written in Santa Fe, signed by some significant people there. And we said, you can pass through. We'll not trouble you, will not bother you, but you can't stay. But then gold was found here. And when gold was found here in Colorado, then of course, white people weren't going away. So they started writing these treaties. So some of the first treaties that they write, obviously, is the one at Fort Laramie. And the Fort Laramie Treaty stated that if there's a piece of land that's being used by the military, by the federal government, and they don't need it anymore, then it reverts back to Native communities. It's an understanding within the treaty that has been used from the Mississippi West to acquire land. They wanted to keep the land, and they wanted, they'd moved into the area. We were stolen from our homes. Some of the people that, particularly the Native communities that were locked up and that were put in internment camps. Today they're called nations or reservations. They're internment camps. The people that were locked up the children were pulled out and indoctrinated and put into schools, and horrible things happened to them. Absolutely horrible things, including murder of the children. And that was a form of genocide, cultural and linguistic and all these other forms of genocide. So we have people who are traumatized by this and continue to live with that trauma. There were these continuous wars that are going on, and there was one war where a treaty was signed. It was called the Treaty of Paris. And in the Treaty of Paris, what they said is, we're going to draw this magic line that extends from up in Canada through the Appalachians and down to the Gulf, right down to Florida. And everything on the east side of this line belongs to the colonies, or you can acquire that land or do whatever you want. But everything on the west side is indigenous land, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to respect that. And so they decided to revolt and said, well, we don't want to be British citizens anymore, because they had speculated on the land on the other side. Speculated means they had claimed some of that land for themselves as individuals. These are our founding fathers. As individuals, we're going to make lots of money off of it. But now this treaty said they couldn't do that. And they had to adhere to this treaty if they were British. But if they were no longer British, they didn't have to adhere to that treaty. So you hear the story all the time about the Boston Tea Party. It had nothing to do with tea and taxes. It had to do with people trying to get rich, greedy people trying to get rich off of the resources on the other side of the mountain. So they went to war with Britain, declared their independence, but nobody recognized them as a community. Nobody recognized them as a nation. They had no king. And so they had, in order to be recognized, they had to be recognized by other nations. So what did they do? They started creating treaties with the only people that would sign treaties with them. One of the first people that they weren't called the United States yet, they were called the Continental Convention or something. The first treaty they signed was with the Delaware, and then they signed a treaty with the Cherokee. By signing treaties with other nations, that gave them status as a nation. But it was never their intent to honor any of these treaties. All they wanted to do was move further and further west, which they continued to do. And so this idea of treaty making is an old idea, right? And their style of doing it here is so effective, was so effective, of displacing people. There are places all around the world the colonizers have used precisely what the Americans have done here, because it works in displacing people. Their approach was different, but there were some tribes, as they began to move from Mexico City further up north, that they kept encountering that they couldn't do anything about. Some of these are known as the Apache. There were some other groups over here, but what they started doing, because they couldn't control them and they would continuously lose the wars, they started some of the first treaties with the people in this area. And those were some of the first treaties with the Apache. And they're actually signed in northern Mexico, and they actually set aside areas for them to be in. But what happens is, if for some reason the invaders get invaded or get attacked, They don't know who attacked them, but they know where some Indians are, because these Indians are over here on this reservation, so they go kill them. And that's been a continuous thing. That happened here in Colorado. That's precisely what happened with the Cheyenne, primarily Cheyenne, but Cheyenne and Arapaho, there was a group of them that were at the Fort Wise, at Fort Wise. And they had already submitted, they're under the white flag, they're staying at the fort intentionally. But Governor Evans and Chivington sent a note down to the person that's overseeing the fort there, and he says, we're coming for the Indians, send them away. He says, you can't do that. They're here peacefully, it's not an issue. But they forced him to, so he told them, you need to leave. So they left and they went to Sand Creek, just a few miles away. They went to Sand Creek, and then that's where Chivington went down. So Chivington knew where they were, went down and massacred them. So that was a continuous thing. If you know where the peaceful Indians are, you don't know where the ruffians are, you can't find them, go kill the peaceful Indians. And that's precisely what they did. That's part of ethnic cleansing. That's what goes on. Another misrepresentation is that if the president goes and speaks in another country, our president of the U.S. goes and speaks in another country, it's understood that he speaks on behalf of the American people. Indigenous people don't work like that. We don't elect leaders. Leaders come up organically for the issues that need to be addressed. And war leaders will come out of that, so we'll follow the war leaders. We do stuff by consensus, and we don't go to war without consensus. And I say war, what we're usually doing is defending ourselves in these instances. So for the Americans to sometimes get individuals drunk, name them as leaders, and then have them sign a treaty is a huge violation. It's a huge mistrust. And they would do anything they could. There were horrible machinations that they incorporated in order to be able to get Native people to sign off. And Indian people don't know what they're signing off, and they have no idea that what they sign, and they're only putting an X, that what they're doing is going to impact not just them, but their community for generations. I mean, think of all the languages: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Inde, Crow, all these languages that people speak. And they have interpreters for all of them to speak English? I don't think so. Theoretically, the First Amendment of the Constitution provides us all the right to pray. And that is the other part, is that in signing these treaties, there's only one treaty that was very specific about religion. That's a Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo signed in 1848 between the U.S. and Mexico. But that one was very specific, and it said people who practice the Catholic religion could continue to do so. And the reason was because the people that are coming across this way are not Catholics, they're Protestants, right? So because of that, they had to make that distinction. That's the only treaty that is distinct about religion. And none of the others do that, but what's understood in the Constitution is that people have the right to pray in their own way, to worship in their own way. And all the different indigenous communities, even within the Apache as an example, which are many communities spread out across several states, they all pray in different ways, right? They're general beliefs, they're general ideas, but it's not a fixed religion. Indigenous people say that we don't fight over religion, that doesn't make any sense, that everybody has their own belief, and that's fine. Given that, when we have attempted to pray, there are ways in which we pray that incorporate the use of drums and incorporate the use of fire, and sometimes incorporate the use of particular medicines, plants that we're used to using. Because of the fire and because of the drums, which non-natives regard as noise, then our ceremonies have been disrupted. Now, they were actually outlawed. When people were locked up on their reservations, they were prohibited from practicing their religious beliefs. I mean, they were literally outlawed. So, and then remember that Native people did not receive citizenship as American citizens. These are American Indians on their own land, are not American citizens until the 1930s. Add the caveat that those that are residing on what's theoretically Indian land, remember, are territories that are internment camps. Native people don't own that land. It's in trust. in trust means the U.S. government continues to own it. So when you think about that, you get to understand the relationship the Native people have had with U.S. government, with treaties, with all this kind of stuff, and how they've been prohibited from exercising any kind of freedom. And that's the same in religion. Now, in 1978, theoretically, 78, 79, the Indian Freedom of Religions Act was passed, but it has no teeth, and nobody's ever done anything with it. There are different acts that have been passed over time, but at the end of the day, we don't really get to practice our religions the way we want. So if we set up a lodge and someone doesn't like it and they come in and they tear it down, they don't realize they're tearing down our church. Then the big one is that, well, there's a fire ban, you can't hold a ceremony. And that's a very common one. So we've had our fires put out multiple times, and our ceremonies stopped all throughout the state of Colorado. So we're continuously fighting with that. The ceremonies that we do are not dangerous because our firekeepers are trained. We're better trained and more trained than firemen. The people that come put out your fires, they're fighting fires. We don't fight fires, we work with fires. We understand fires. To us, fire is life. We have a relationship with it. We are Americans because you encroached on our land and made us Americans. So we should have full American citizenship, and that includes our right to pray and to live and to be who we are. So because there is this white guilt around that, the fact that your privileges come from crime, that you want to make up for that, what they've done is they said, we're going to open up our universities to you. And that's one of the things that CSU did. They said, send us all your Native students. We'll take care of them. And at first, initially they did. They didn't have the infrastructure to do that. So they're placing Native students in the homes of people that were, these are culture shocks. And so they didn't last, they didn't do well there. But eventually CSU just forgot about that and stopped taking. So if you're Native and you go to CSU now, you're going to pay full tuition. But we can actually work this out if you just get over your white guilt, get over your resistance, and finally acknowledge, you know what, we're on somebody else's land, and it behooves us to work with them so that we live in harmony.